In the quiet stone-bound city of Strasbourg, during the 14th century, you would have walked narrow streets paved with worn limestone, the soft sound of wooden clogs echoing through alleys that smelled faintly of smoke, damp straw, and slow-moving river water. The city itself seemed slow and unhurried, but beneath that calm surface was a system that had to function precisely, day after day, for thousands of people to survive. One of the most important parts of that invisible system was water. You might be surprised by how carefully medieval cities managed their water. There were no modern pipes, no mechanical pumps, no pressure systems. Everything depended on gravity, wells, wooden conduits, stone channels, and the careful maintenance of public fountains. Strasbourg, situated close to the River Ill, relied on a network of wells spread across different neighborhoods. Each well served a cluster of families, bakers, brewers, tanners, and laundresses. Buckets were lowered by ropes made of hemp, and the wood of the well frames had to be replaced regularly to prevent collapse. In ordinary times, this system was boring in the most comforting way. It worked quietly, every day, without notice. But in the year 1349, ordinary routine became suspicion. The Black Death was spreading across Europe, moving along trade routes, rivers, and roads at a pace that terrified everyone. People did not understand bacteria or fleas. They understood only the visible pattern. Healthy people drank water, and then they died. Homes that had once felt safe became places of fear. Wells, once symbols of life, became objects of quiet dread. A rumor began, as these things often do, slowly and without a clear beginning. Someone said that the water tasted strange. Someone else said a neighbor had seen a dark substance floating near the bucket. Another said that a stranger was seen leaning over the well late at night. In taverns and marketplaces, the whispers became sharper. The wells were being poisoned. To you, standing in that time, the idea did not feel foolish. Without scientific knowledge, the pattern felt logical. People drank water. People died. Therefore, the water must be the weapon. But here is where the so-called conspiracy took a darker shape. The whispers did not stay vague. They began to name a group, the Jewish residents of the city. Strasbourg had a small Jewish community that lived under specific legal restrictions. They paid special taxes, were often forbidden to own land, and were protected and controlled by city authorities depending on political convenience. They lived close enough to be visible, but distant enough to be considered separate. In times of calm, this separation was tolerated. In times of fear, it became dangerous. You would have seen people at the wells hesitate to draw water. You would have noticed glances turning sharp when someone unfamiliar passed by. People stopped speaking when Jewish neighbors walked through the market. The idea that had once been a vague fear now had a target. Official statements were made by city leaders that they were investigating claims of poison. No evidence was produced, but that did not matter. The lack of evidence made the fear grow larger, not smaller. What most people did not know, what was not spoken aloud in the streets, was that wells truly were vulnerable. Medieval security around water sources was simple. A wooden cover, if one existed, could be lifted. Buckets could be tampered with. A determined person could introduce ash, animal remains, or plant toxins into a well without much effort. There were no chemical tests, no purification systems. The city depended entirely on trust and routine. This is where the uncomfortable truth begins to form behind the conspiracy. While the accusation against the Jewish community was false and led to horrific violence, later records and archaeological studies have shown that well contamination was not imaginary. In times of siege and war, armies did poison wells. Rival cities had done it. It was a known tactic, even if rarely spoken about in public documents. Poisoning a well required knowledge of plants such as deadly nightshade, hemlock, or certain mineral compounds. Apothecaries knew these substances well. Soldiers were sometimes trained to destroy water supplies without leaving obvious traces. But in Strasbourg, no invading army was present. No open enemy stood at the gates. Instead, fear focused inward. If you had stood near the central well during those months, you might have seen guards placed nearby, not to protect the water from outsiders, but to watch certain residents. You might have heard quiet debates among city elders about whether burning the Jewish quarter would stop the plague. Water buckets still rose and fell, splashing softly, but now with hands that trembled. Then came a darker development, one that history would confirm only centuries later through surviving council documents. The city council, already burdened by debt, saw an opportunity. This is where the true conspiracy shifted from fantasy to fact. Strasbourg owed money to Jewish moneylenders. Many Christian merchants and nobles did. Under medieval legal structures, debts to Jewish lenders were enforceable and carried real consequences. But if the lenders were gone, the debts could be erased. So while the public story focused on poisoned wells, another quiet plan unfolded in candle-lit rooms made of stone. Records that survived in fragments show that some city leaders discussed that the deaths of Jewish lenders would conveniently eliminate outstanding financial obligations. The plague created the fear created the accusation created the political opportunity. On Valentine's Day in 1349, nearly the entire Jewish population of Strasbourg was burned alive or expelled. Officially, the reason given was the poisoning of the wells, but buried in tax records, debt ledgers, and charters preserved in later archives is the truth that historians now largely agree upon. The well poisoning story was used as a cover for a calculated financial and political purge. Yet, the wells themselves were still not safe. After the massacre, people continued to die. Water remained contaminated, not by poison, but by poor sanitation, runoff from crowded burial sites, and the natural presence of bacteria that no one could see. The conspiracy had removed a community, but it did not remove the disease. You can imagine the silence afterward. The wells still stood, the ropes still creaked, the buckets still dipped into the dark water below. The city had acted on a theory that felt real. The crime that people feared did exist in military science, but the people who were punished were not the ones responsible. And still, one question would have lingered quietly in the minds of those who survived. If wells could be poisoned so easily, and if powerful people were willing to lie about who did it, then who truly controlled the most essential thing of all, the water itself? After the fires had cooled, and the ashes had been swept from the stones, Strasbourg did not become peaceful. You might think that once the feared community was gone, the city would breathe easier. Instead, a quieter tension settled in, heavier than before. The wells were still there. The water was still drawn. The sickness still came. In the months that followed, people began to realize something uncomfortable. Removing the supposed poisoners had not made the water pure. If you had walked through the city at dawn, you would have seen the next layer of the story reveal itself. Not in dramatic gestures, but in slow, ordinary routines. Carts rolled through the streets, collecting waste. Households emptied chamber pots into open drains. Tanners washed animal hides in shallow streams that led back toward the river. Blood from slaughtered livestock ran across cobbles and vanished into gutters that joined the same hidden channels that fed the wells. Nobody fully understood what this meant, but people noticed the smells. They noticed the color of the water after heavy rain. They noticed that certain wells were worse than others, especially the ones closest to burial grounds. The plague had filled graveyards beyond their limits. Bodies were placed in shallow pits or stacked carelessly when time ran out. As rain fell, it carried a slow, invisible runoff into the ground. The wells, dug deep but not sealed, drank this water back up. This was not a theory. This was not a rumor. This was happening, quietly, without any human hand adding poison. Yet the fear of intentional poisoning did not fade. In fact, it transformed. The city council ordered more guards at the wells. Wooden covers were reinforced. Chains and locks were added. People approaching the wells were watched. Buckets were inspected for strange residues. If an herbal smell was detected, a panic could begin. Here is where you begin to see the strange mixture of truth and misunderstanding that made medieval conspiracies so powerful. People were right to fear contaminated water. They were wrong about who was responsible. But something else, far less visible, was also happening inside the machinery of the city. With the Jewish community gone, money did not simply disappear. Debt records were seized. Properties were quietly redistributed. Homes were occupied by new tenants. Shops were handed to favored guild members. The story of poisoned wells remained the public explanation, but the real work of the conspiracy unfolded in silence through paperwork and stamped seals. You can imagine scribes bending over ledgers by candlelight, dipping quills into ink, crossing out names, rewriting ownership, adjusting figures. It was not noisy. It was not dramatic. It was slow, methodical, and perfectly legal within the framework they created for themselves. For ordinary people, the effects were small but constant. Rents changed. New landlords appeared. Taxes shifted routes in unseen directions. The plague had shaken the surface of life, but beneath it, the structure of power had quietly been rearranged. Now, something even more subtle began. As the fear of well poisoning spread through other cities, Strasbourg became both an example and a warning. Travelers carried stories along trade routes. They spoke of how the city had uncovered a plot. They did not mention the financial motives. They spoke only of poisoned water and secret enemies. Other towns began to examine their own wells with similar fear. This led to a new kind of behavior across medieval Europe. Wells were moved. In some cities, wells that had existed in central marketplaces for generations were filled in and abandoned. New wells were dug in places thought to be safer, but safety was measured by distance from minority neighborhoods, cemeteries, or trade workshops, not by sanitation. You would have seen the quiet labor of digging, the slow turning of soil, the wood frames being assembled. People believed they were protecting themselves from hidden attackers, when in reality they were still drawing water through the same contaminated earth. Behind the scenes, there were individuals who understood more than they were allowed to say. Some apothecaries noticed patterns. They saw that sickness spread faster in neighborhoods with stagnant drains. They noticed that households who boiled water fell ill less often. A few itinerant healers began to advise this practice, speaking softly so as not to attract attention. But these were not powerful voices. The larger machinery still moved according to fear. In Strasbourg, small records survived that centuries later would allow historians to reconstruct the truth. City council minutes described emergency meetings about debts. Payment disputes vanished from the books directly after the massacre. Properties tied to lenders were transferred within weeks. None of this was explained publicly. The conspiracy, in its true form, was never written as a story. It survived as numbers in ledgers and carefully worded charters. Meanwhile, the people at the wells continued to experience reality as a series of small, anxious choices. Do you draw water from this well, or do you walk 3 streets farther to one that seems cleaner? Do you trust the bucket that everyone uses, or do you bring your own? Do you speak when you see someone unfamiliar near the well, or do you remain silent? These were survival strategies born of confusion, not knowledge. And still, actual well poisoning did not disappear from history. During later wars, soldiers did throw animal carcasses into enemy wells. They did crush poisonous plants and mix them into water sources. This was not myth. It was war practice. It was taught, planned, and recorded in military manuals long after Strasbourg. The frightening part is that the citizens of Strasbourg were not foolish for believing it could happen. They were wrong only about the target. As time moved forward, the official story of Strasbourg became simplified. Books spoke of hysteria, of superstition, of ignorance. But this misses something important. The city was right to fear contaminated water. The city was right that wells were vulnerable. The city was wrong to believe the simple story placed before them. And behind that wrong belief, powerful people quietly solved their own problems. Debt vanished. Land changed hands. Legal obstacles disappeared. You can imagine how this realization crept into later generations of scholars. Sitting in quiet libraries, they turned brittle pages of tax records. They noticed missing entries. They compared dates. They found that the massacre did not just follow fear, it followed financial meetings. The poisoned wells were real in one sense, and false in another. Real as a danger, false as a justification. As you linger beside the stone well in your imagination, the surface calm, the bucket disappearing into darkness, you might feel how strange it is that the most boring part of life, the daily act of drawing water, could be connected to one of the darkest truths of power. And yet, there is still something unfinished in this story. Because even after the council achieved its goals, and even after the fear faded, the wells themselves continued to be used. They were never fully purified. They were never understood. And in later years, new deaths, new rumors, and new quiet meetings would happen around the same sources of water. So the question remains. Hanging like a soft echo in the stone walls, if fear could be shaped so easily, and truth buried so quietly, what else might have been hidden beneath the ordinary routines of medieval life? By the time the quiet years returned to Strasbourg, the true shape of what had happened had already hardened into stone. You can imagine the city settling back into what people would call normal life. Market stalls returned to their places. Church bells resumed their measured rhythm. Children learned to carry small buckets of water without spilling a drop. The wells remained where they had always been, dark circles in the ground that held both survival and memory. What changed was not visible. The families who had once lived near certain streets were gone. Their workshops were used by others. Their gardens, once tended carefully, had new hands turning the soil, and the debts that had once bound powerful households were quietly erased from existence, replaced by the clean lines of new ledgers. If you had stood beside a well years later, watching a woman lower a wooden bucket into the dark, you would have seen nothing unusual. The rope moved. The bucket disappeared. The soft splash echoed upward, but under that calm routine, something had permanently shifted inside the city. The conspiracy, now made real by later historians, did not end in fire, it ended in silence. The strangest part of this story is how it became boring. Not boring in the sense of empty, boring in the way that everyday routines can hide enormous truths. People stopped speaking of poisoned wells as a danger, and began to speak of it as a chapter that had already closed. The danger, they believed, had passed. In reality, the city had simply learned how to forget. Centuries later, when scholars opened old boxes of parchment and read the careful handwriting of medieval clerks, they began to see patterns. They noticed that large numbers of loans vanished from the records after the massacre. They traced how properties shifted hands without normal legal procedures. They found language in council notes that spoke of public safety, while private notes spoke of burdens lifted and obligations removed. This discovery did not come with drama or shouting. It came quietly, in reading rooms, in dust-filled archives, under soft lamplight. Historians did not find written confessions. They found gaps, and those gaps revealed more than any dramatic proclamation could. At the same time, science slowly explained what medieval people could not see. Bacteria, waterborne disease, contamination from burial grounds, runoff from waste. All of these were mapped and demonstrated long after the people of Strasbourg had died. The wells were not poisoned by human hands, but they were dangerous in another way, a way that no one at the time could have understood. This is where the story becomes difficult to judge, even in the present. The people of the city were not foolish to fear their wells. They were not wrong to sense that water could kill. They were wrong only in how that fear was used. The real crime was not simply ignorance, it was guidance. Fear did not grow by itself. It was shaped, quiet words behind closed doors pointed it in a direction that was useful to those who held power. The accusation served two purposes. It gave people a simple story for their suffering, and it cleared away financial problems that had no other easy solution. You can imagine one of the city leaders staring into a flickering flame late at night, telling himself that this was necessary, that order had to be preserved. That stability was more important than truth. These were not monsters in the modern sense. They were ordinary men protecting their position, their families, and their wealth. That is why this story belongs to the world of boring history. The truth was not built from dramatic villains. It was built from routine decisions, small meetings, signed documents, and quiet erasures. As the decades passed, the legend of the poisoned wells became simpler. It became a warning tale about superstition and mob violence. The financial motives faded from memory. They survived only in forgotten storage rooms of monasteries and dust-covered civic buildings. But the wells themselves never forgot. Stone absorbs sound, wood absorbs water, the earth absorbs memory in its own silent way. Each time a bucket was lowered, it passed by layers of soil that had once been soaked with fear, with grief, and with unspoken truth. Later wars would bring real well poisoning. Soldiers would throw corpses into water. They would crush poisonous plants and spread their extracts. These acts were written down, taught, and repeated. The tactic was real. The danger was real. This makes the Strasbourg story stranger, not simpler. The city had feared something that existed in the world, but they used that fear to justify something else entirely. They had sensed a real vulnerability, but they allowed powerful people to define its meaning. When you think of the quiet people in this story, you do not think of leaders. You think of the laundress who boiled her water because she noticed fewer sicknesses in her children. You think of the baker who walked farther each morning to use a different well. You think of the child who wondered why certain neighbors were never seen again, but was never given a clear answer. These are the people who carried the real history forward without knowing it. The legacy of Strasbourg did not live in the ashes. It lived in patterns of fear that repeated themselves in other cities. It lived in the way authorities learned how easily a story could be shaped. It lived in the quiet lesson that when something ordinary becomes frightening, it becomes a tool. In modern times, you still live with wells of a different kind. Water systems are hidden in pipes and stations. You trust that they are safe without seeing the process. And when something goes wrong, when contamination happens, or when authorities lie, the same pattern quietly appears. Fear looks for a shape. Power offers a story. Truth hides in records few people read. As you sit quietly and imagine the stone well of Strasbourg, you can almost hear the slow creak of the rope and the hollow sound of the bucket rising. The surface of the water remains calm, reflecting only darkness and a circle of sky. Beneath that surface, things are still moving, unseen, just as they were centuries ago. This is the final truth of the poisoned wells. The conspiracy was not only about water, it was about how fear can be guided away from truth and toward convenience, and how ordinary routines can become the foundation for extraordinary injustice. The city survived. The wells endured. The truth waited quietly in ink and parchment. And even now, as you consider this quiet story, a final thought lingers gently in your mind. If this much could be hidden in something as simple and as boring as a well, what other small, ordinary parts of history might still be holding their secrets in the dark beneath your feet? In the quiet rhythm of medieval Europe, there were places where power did not look powerful. You might walk past them without noticing much at all. A stone hall, a courtyard with worn flagstones, a chapel lit by oil lamps that flickered softly against whitewashed walls. These places belonged to an order of men who called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, known more simply as the Knights Templar. If you had encountered one of them in the late 12th or early 13th century, you might not have been impressed. Their clothing was plain, their horses were strong but not decorative, their buildings were functional rather than grand. Everything about them suggested discipline, regularity, and a life built from schedules rather than spectacle. That is why the story that later formed around them feels strange even now. Because quietly, without display, they became one of the most powerful financial organizations in medieval Europe. When you think of the medieval world, you may imagine gold coins, chests with iron locks, and strongboxes buried under stone floors. In reality, much of medieval wealth moved through writing, seals, and careful systems of trust. The Templars perfected this slow and careful art. A pilgrim traveling from France to Jerusalem could deposit money with the Templars in Paris and receive a written document. In distant lands, that document could be presented and redeemed for funds. This was an early form of banking. The writing was dull, the process was repetitive, but it was reliable. For kings, nobles, and merchants, this system was invaluable. You, standing quietly in one of their halls, would have seen men bent over wooden tables, writing with quills. You would have smelled parchment and ink. You would have noticed shelves lined with nothing more dramatic than rolled documents tied with string. The power of the Templars was stored not in treasure rooms, but in records. This is where the conspiracy first appeared. When something is powerful and invisible, people begin to wonder what else it might be hiding. By the early 1400s, the Knights Templar had become wealthy through land grants, donations, and management of estates. They owned farms, vineyards, mills, and workshops. They collected rents and stored supplies. However, they did not spend much. Their lifestyle remained strictly controlled. This made them appear more mysterious. And so the rumors began. Some said they had found ancient secrets beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Others claimed they had uncovered holy relics. Some whispered that they guarded vast treasure chambers hidden under forests, fields, and castles. At the same time, there was a man who had a very practical reason to care about them. King Philip the Fair of France was deeply in debt. He had borrowed money from the Templars to fund wars, administration, and lavish court expenses. This debt was not theoretical. It was written in detailed records, kept by Templar clerks, and sealed with official marks. The king owed them a great deal, and the obligation sat quietly on paper, waiting. Just as in Strasbourg, where fear was shaped into a story, here another need was forming quietly. Debt, frustration, opportunity. You might imagine the king walking slowly through his stone palace, listening to the sound of his own steps. He could not simply cancel the debt. That would break the carefully balanced system of medieval power. But he could remove the creditor. The plan did not arrive loudly. It did not crash through the doors. It arrived in whispers among trusted officials. in discussions held late at night, in meetings that looked boring from the outside. And then, on a quiet morning in the year 1307, the arrests began. Across France, Knights Templar were seized, not with shouting, but with official warrants. Doors were knocked, men were taken from their beds and escorted away. Their buildings were searched, chests were opened, shelves of records were inspected. It was not chaos, it was procedure. The accusations were shocking. Heresy, secret rituals, worship of false idols, spitting on the cross, obscene ceremonies held in darkness. To you, hearing this in that time, it might have sounded believable. The order was secretive. Their ceremonies were private. Their buildings were closed to outsiders. People already believed they had hidden knowledge. The leap from mystery to guilt was not a large one. But here is where the conspiracy begins to touch something real. The trials were not fair. Men were tortured. Confessions were extracted. Stories were shaped until they fit the desired narrative. And behind all of it sat the quiet problem of money. The true treasure was not chests of gold buried by lantern light. The true treasure was land, debt records, and written claims of ownership. When Templar leaders were imprisoned and their order destroyed, those records became meaningless. With the stroke of a quill, years of obligation vanished. That part of the story is not speculation. It is supported by surviving accounts. But the mystery does not end there. Because when investigators went through Templar properties, they did not find what they expected. There were no vast hoards of gold, no underground vaults filled with glittering relics, no dramatic piles of jewels. What they found were documents, grain stores, account books, fields, slowly accumulated wealth in the form of working infrastructure. And yet, something seemed missing. Some records vanished. Some goods were never accounted for. Some chests listed in inventories were never seen again. You can picture a clerk standing in a quiet stone room, reading a list that did not match what sat before him. A simple line of text described objects that were not there. There was no shouting, only a frown, a pause, a reed pen hovering over parchment. This is where the idea of the vanishing treasure took shape. Not treasure in the sense of sparkling gold, but records, movable wealth, and transportable assets. The Knights Templar were disciplined. They followed schedules. They anticipated danger. They had communication networks. They owned ships. They had contacts in distant ports. It is historically documented that some Templars escaped arrest. It is known that a fleet left from La Rochelle shortly before the mass arrests. Where those ships went is not fully recorded in surviving documents. This is not myth. It is absence. It is a blank space in the paperwork of history. For centuries, people have tried to fill that blank with stories of hidden gold, buried chests, guarded caves, and secret maps. These stories are often exaggerated, but behind them sits a quieter, more boring, and more believable truth. A disciplined organization with advance notice could move documents, money, and portable goods. Not dramatically. Quietly. At night. With the same care they used for everything. And so the theory was born, a conspiracy that was different from fantasy. Not that they had magical artifacts, but that they outmaneuvered their enemies. If you were a Templar in those last quiet weeks before the arrests, what would you do? You would not announce your fear. You would not tell your enemies. You would simply move what mattered most, and leave behind what was heavy and replaceable. Tonight, the carts would roll. Tomorrow the shelves would be lighter. No one would notice until it was too late. Meanwhile, King Philip and his officials grew frustrated. They had destroyed the order. Yes, they had seized lands. Yes, but the neat erasure of debt felt incomplete. They had expected to find more power in objects. What they had destroyed was a system, not a horde. The conspiracy theory did not grow from wildness. It grew from disappointment. Something was missing. Something had slipped away. And that missing something became a whisper that has never fully stopped. As you stand quietly in the image of a stone Templar hall, you can almost hear the sound of quills on parchment, soft footfalls, the turning of pages, the gentle closing of wooden chests. You can feel how power lived not in jewels, but in careful habits. And still, one part of this story remains unfinished, hovering quietly in the air. If the Templars truly moved their most important possessions away, where did they go, and who quietly began using them after the order disappeared? As medieval towns slowly grew, time became something people began to measure more carefully, though not with watches or clocks as we know them today. In these early centuries, time lived in the sky, moving with the sun, the stars, and the gentle rhythm of prayer bells. In monasteries, monks divided the day into sacred hours. Before the first light of dawn, they rose quietly from their wooden beds to chant prayers in cold stone halls. Their voices echoed through candlelit chambers, marking the beginning of another peaceful cycle. These moments were not rushed. Everything unfolded slowly, like the turning of pages in a very old book. Outside the monastery walls, villagers followed the same invisible clock. Farmers listened for church bells to know when morning work should begin. The soft ringing drifted across fields of wheat and barley, carried by cool air and morning mist. When the bells rang again at midday, tools were laid down and people rested briefly beneath wide-open skies. There were no precise minutes or seconds. There was only light, shadow, sound, and silence. People trusted nature to guide them. When sunlight stretched long across the ground, it was time to return home. When stars blinked into the darkening sky, it was time to rest. Some larger towns began to install early mechanical clocks in tall towers. These clocks were heavy and slow, driven by hanging stones and turning gears. They did not show minutes, only the steady beating of hours. Each chime was deep and comforting, like a heartbeat for the entire town. Time in the medieval world did not feel rushed. It moved gently, peacefully, in harmony with life itself. And in that quiet rhythm, people found a kind of calm that modern life rarely allows. As daylight softened and slipped beyond the horizon, the medieval world eased into its quietest hours, without bright lamps or glowing screens. Evening arrived gently, like a soft blanket being pulled across the land. Shadows lengthened, fires dimmed, and the sounds of daily work faded into the calm of approaching night. In small cottages, families gathered close to the warmth of a hearth. Flames flickered against rough wooden beams, sending faint patterns dancing across the walls. People spoke in low, unhurried voices while preparing for rest. Some mended simple tools, others shared stories, and children listened with heavy eyes, lulled by the crackling fire. Across the countryside, the monastery bells marked the final hour of prayer. Their tones drifted slowly through the cool darkness, reminding everyone that the day's journey had reached its end. Monks moved through shadowed cloisters, their footsteps soft against stone floors polished by many generations. Night did not belong to the hurried. It belonged to stillness. The faint hoot of an owl, the soft rustle of trees, and the distant bark of a guarding dog were the only sounds that stirred the air. The moon cast a pale glow over quiet fields and sleeping villages, shaping silver outlines of thatched roofs and winding lanes. For travelers resting at roadside inns, night offered safety and shelter. They lay on simple straw beds, listening to the muted creak of wooden beams and the gentle rise and fall of wind outside. In these soft moments, time seemed to slow even further, as though the world held its breath until morning. And so each day ended as it had for centuries. Without haste, without strain, wrapped in the natural rhythm of darkness and light, the people of the medieval world drifted into sleep, trusting the dawn to come and carry them into another peaceful cycle. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe moved slowly through days shaped by soil, stone, prayer, and repetition. You would have heard the steady scrape of wooden ploughs in the fields, the dull rhythm of hammers on iron, and the low murmur of voices inside thick-walled homes. Life followed habits that had not changed for generations. Water came from wells, bread came from grain, comfort came from routine. Then came the sickness. At first it arrived quietly, a fever here, a swelling there. Someone stops working, someone stays inside, someone does not rise from their straw bed in the morning. Villagers began to notice the pattern, not through announcements, but through absence. One less voice at the well, one less shadow in the field, one empty stool at the table. When the Black Death spread across medieval Europe, people looked for explanations because the human mind does not like silence in the face of fear. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know about fleas. They did not know about rats hiding under floors and inside grain sacks. What they knew was that people were dying quickly, painfully, and without warning. So they turned to stories. One of the most widespread beliefs was that wells were being poisoned. The rumor moved faster than the sickness itself. It did not rely on facts. It relied on fear. People began to whisper that outsiders were creeping into villages at night, dropping powders or liquids into the water. They said it was travelers. They said it was lepers. They said it was religious minorities. They said it was enemies of the town. At first, this was only a conspiracy theory, a story with no proof, a desperate attempt to make meaning from chaos. But what makes this story different is that parts of it turned out to contain a strange and uncomfortable truth, though not in the way medieval people believed. You can imagine standing beside a stone well in a quiet village. The wooden bucket creaks as it is lowered. The rope rubs against the stone. The water below glimmers faintly in the darkness. This water gave life. It cooked meals. It washed wounds. It cooled fevers. When fear entered the hearts of villagers, this well transformed in their minds from a source of safety into a possible weapon. Historical records show that many towns and cities began to investigate supposed well poisoning plots. Officials questioned strangers. They arrested people based on rumors. Confessions were often forced through pain, fear, or exhaustion. Entire communities turned on those who lived at the margins of society. For a long time, historians believed these stories were only symptoms of paranoia, and for the most part, they were. There was no organized group traveling from town to town poisoning wells to spread the plague. There was no grand network of enemies carrying secret powders. That part was untrue. But what later research revealed was quieter, slower, and far more unsettling. The wells were not being deliberately poisoned, but they were, in many places, becoming contaminated in ways medieval people could not see or understand. Villagers often built wells close to graveyards because the ground was already consecrated and familiar. When the Black Death struck, the number of deaths was so overwhelming that mass graves were dug quickly, sometimes near water sources. Bodies were buried in shallow pits because there was not enough time, space, or strength to dig deeper. As rainfall passed through soil filled with human decay, fluids seeped downward. Wells, which reached into the same underground water systems, slowly became contaminated. The water changed in ways too subtle for the eye to detect. It remained clear, it remained cold, it remained seemingly pure. You can imagine lifting the bucket, seeing your reflection in the surface of the water, and trusting it with your life. In addition to grave contamination, animal waste also played a role. Rats died in large numbers during the plague. They fell into wells. They were washed into cracks in stonework. They decayed unseen. Bacteria moved silently through water that people believed to be safe. So while the medieval theory of intentional poisoning was wrong, the belief that wells had become dangerous was, in many cases, tragically correct. The conspiracy did not collapse. It transformed. People feared an enemy with a face, when the real danger was hidden in the earth beneath their feet. They searched for villains, when the truth was a quiet process of contamination, seepage, and decay. Everyday life became shaped by water fear. People tried to boil water when they could, though fuel was precious. Some walked long distances to draw water from springs outside the village. Others drank watered-down wine or ale, believing it to be safer. Routine habits began to fracture under the weight of invisible danger. From your place as a listener, you can almost feel the hesitation in their hands. The pause before lifting the cup, the slight tightening of the jaw before swallowing, the small, silent prayer whispered not in grand churches, but in the quiet space between fear and thirst. Monks recorded concerns in dusty manuscripts. City councils passed rules about where burials could take place. Wells were covered with wooden lids in some towns. Guards were posted near water sources to prevent imagined sabotage. And yet, no one could guard against what lay unseen. Archaeological evidence now supports what these people could not name. Soil samples taken from medieval well sites contain traces of plague bacteria. Layers of human waste and animal remains have been found leaching into ancient water systems. The conspiracy of well poisoning, though false in intention, pointed toward a truth of environmental contamination that no one could scientifically describe at the time. What makes this story so quietly powerful is not the screaming panic of the streets, but the slow shift in behavior. You can picture a village adjusting without understanding why. You can picture a mother hesitating before giving her child a drink. You can picture an old man remembering when the water felt safe. The medieval world did not solve this mystery. It lived inside it. Even as the plague subsided, the memory of dangerous wells remained. Stories were passed down for generations. Some people continued to believe in hidden poisoners. Others simply accepted that water could betray them without warning. In later centuries, when science finally explained bacteria and groundwater contamination, Historians began to see the old conspiracy in a new light. The medieval people were wrong about the enemy, but right about the threat. They sensed danger long before they could define it. And in that strange overlap of fear and truth, a simple rumor about poisoned wells transformed into one of the earliest examples of environmental health awareness, born not from knowledge, but from survival instinct. As you sit with this slow history, you might wonder something that people of that time could never ask clearly, if they were so close to the truth without realizing it. What other dangers surrounded them silently, hidden in the ordinary objects they trusted every day? As the Great Plague continued to move through towns and countryside, daily life did not stop all at once. It thinned slowly, like fog creeping across a field. It covered ordinary habits in uncertainty. You can imagine waking each morning not with panic, but with a quiet question which no one asked aloud: is the water safe today? Wells were central to medieval survival. They were not only holes in the ground filled with water, they were gathering places, social centers, sites of ritual and habit. You would stand beside neighbors and draw water in the same motion every day. The sound of rope against stone was as familiar as breathing. When fear of poisoned wells began to spread, that familiar sound became uneasy. Buckets were lifted more slowly. Hands hesitated on rope. People watched the water surface with suspicion rather than comfort. The earth itself was changing in ways no one could measure. During the Black Death, towns buried the dead faster than tradition allowed. Lime was sometimes scattered over graves. Soil was turned again and again. Rain came, as it always did, and soaked into the disturbed ground. It passed through rotting cloth, collapsing lungs, broken skin, and decaying bone before moving downward toward underground streams. The medieval mind believed in balance of humors and divine will. It did not believe in microbes. When the water tasted the same, smelled the same, and looked the same, it was assumed to be unchanged. But the water had slowly become a carrier of invisible life and death. You can picture the quietness of it. No bubbles, no warning color, no sudden stench. The danger did not shout, it seeped. Monasteries were among the first places to quietly adapt. Monks often kept careful routines and spent long hours observing small changes. Their chroniclers wrote of strange patterns, whole groups of brothers falling ill after drinking from certain wells, sickness appearing shortly after communal meals prepared with the same water. They did not know what bacteria were, but they began to notice that certain water sources were followed by more sickness than others. In some abbeys you would see a quiet shift. Wells once trusted for generations were covered. New wells were dug further from burial grounds. Instructions were added to rule books that water should be boiled longer in times of illness. These were not scientific discoveries. They were habits born from slow, painful trial. Cities reacted in their own slow ways. Councils issued orders that graves should be moved outside city walls. They marked forbidden zones for new wells. They rebuilt stone linings around older wells, believing that thicker walls would keep out the rot of the earth. Workers were hired to clean wells using simple tools. They were lowered by rope into the darkness, scraping slime from stone with chisels and brushes. You can imagine the smell. The cold, the fear of being trapped in a narrow shaft of stone, while unseen water slowly dripped from above. Some of them became sick after such work. Others survived and told stories of foul deposits and dead animals lodged in cracks they could not reach. Rats, which had once moved easily through grain stores and walls, died in massive numbers during the plague. Their bodies slipped into wells through broken covers or cracked stone. They floated unseen in darkness before sinking. Their decay changed the water in ways no medieval person could explain. Villagers continued to share rumors, not just of poisoners, but of cursed wells. Wells that once served faithful families now stood unused. Wooden lids were nailed shut. Stones were stacked atop openings, like small graves for water itself. You might be walking through such a village in your imagination. The streets quieter, the well silent, no children laughing, no neighbors chatting, only the hollow shape of daily life left behind. Some people adapted by drinking weak ale instead of water. Fermentation killed some dangers, though they did not know why. Wine was watered down and shared even by children. Boiling water became more common, though firewood was precious. A strange balance formed. People did not abandon water. They learned to fear it gently. Archaeologists, many centuries later, would uncover the truth trapped in layers of earth. They found soil around ancient wells saturated with bacteria related to plague. They found rat remains packed into collapsed stone walls. They found markers showing wells dug dangerously close to long-forgotten mass graves. What the medieval world experienced as rumor was, in truth, a slow disaster of environment and ignorance. The most unsettling part is how calmly it unfolded. There were no sirens, no announcements, no lectures, only the slow noticing of patterns by tired minds. A neighbor dies after drawing water. A monk falls ill after the evening meal. A family leaves their well and walks further each morning without fully knowing why. You can sense the quiet courage in that, not the bravery of swords or battles, but the bravery of waking each day and adjusting small habits in a world that no longer made sense. The conspiracy did not disappear at once. People still feared unseen enemies. They still watched strangers. They still told stories of nighttime poisoners. But beneath those stories, a more practical truth began to form. Water could betray you without hatred. The earth could harm you without intention. This slow realization laid early groundwork for future public health. Though medieval people never called it that, they learned to build wells differently. They learned to separate graves from water sources. They learned to cover and protect what fed them. All of it came not from knowledge, but from watching, remembering, and enduring. As this quiet understanding spread, you might wonder something they never had the words to ask. If the simple act of drawing water could hide such danger, how many other ordinary parts of their lives carried silent risks they never imagined? Long after the worst days of the plague had passed, the wells remained. They were still carved from stone. They were still lined with worn brick. They still held dark, cold water that reflected the sky in faint, trembling patterns, but they were no longer innocent. You can imagine walking through a medieval village, years after the Great Sickness. New voices filled the streets. New children carried small buckets. The fields once again showed steady lines of grain. Life, as it always does, had returned to its slow rhythm. Yet beneath this calm surface, habits had changed. People no longer trusted water without thought. Some wells were left abandoned, their openings choked with weeds or sealed with stone. Others were ringed with warning, not written in letters, but in stories whispered by elders. Do not draw from that one. Go further down the road. Take the longer path. Village leaders quietly began placing new wells on higher ground, not because they understood groundwater, but because they noticed that those wells seemed safer. Burial grounds were pushed outward. Churches marked boundaries that had not existed before. The earth itself became something to map in new ways. In monasteries, rules grew longer. Water was to be boiled when the sick were many. Vessels were to be cleaned more carefully. Brothers assigned to kitchen work were watched with gentle suspicion, not because they were dangerous, but because the process of preparation was now treated as meaningful. Even without science, a kind of discipline emerged. You can picture a monk lifting a pot of water over a small flame, waiting patiently as bubbles slowly formed. He did not know about bacteria. He only knew that sometimes, those who drank boiled water seemed to survive longer. That was enough. Over time, the story of poisoned wells softened. It became less about strangers, and more about place. Certain wells were remembered as bad. Certain springs were remembered as good. Entire villages shifted their layouts according to this quiet memory. When modern archaeologists began digging into medieval well sites, they found something remarkable. Layers of history preserved in mud and stone, traces of bacteria, remnants of rope, decayed wood, broken buckets. It told the story of hands lowering containers again and again, year after year, even in times of fear. Science eventually named what medieval people only felt. Reusinia pestis, waterborne contamination, environmental seepage. But the emotional truth had been understood much earlier. Water could be dangerous, even when it looked pure. The conspiracy of well poisoning, once fueled by terror, slowly transformed into a kind of wisdom without words. It lost its villains and kept its caution. You can reflect on how gentle this change was. There was no single moment of discovery, no celebration, no announcement, only the slow adjustment of ordinary life. Children grew up being told to draw water carefully. Travelers learned which wells to avoid. Whole communities built their trust, not on proof, but on memory. And most of this happened quietly. The world did not credit anyone. No one was praised for these changes. No one received medals for choosing safer ground. Yet millions of small decisions made by tired, ordinary people slowly shaped a safer environment. This is how much of real history moves. Not through grand realizations, but through small corrections made in the dark. When modern people look back, they often laugh at the old conspiracy. They call it superstition. They dismiss it as ignorance. And in many ways it was. The medieval people were wrong about secret enemies traveling in the night. But they were right about something deeper. Their world was contaminated in ways they could not see. Their instincts pointed them toward a danger that science would only later explain. This quiet story leaves you with a soft and unsettling thought to carry into the present. If people so long ago were able to sense invisible dangers around them without knowing what to call them, then how many things in the modern world might we sense without fully understanding? How many quiet threats live inside ordinary routines today, waiting not for fear, but for gentle attention to reveal them? In the quiet hours of medieval Europe, when candlelight trembled against cold stone walls and footsteps echoed softly through narrow corridors, there existed an order of men who inspired both calm and unease. They were known as the Knights Templar. You might imagine them as armored riders on pale horses, but their truest power did not lie in swords or shields. It lay in silence, paperwork, and patterns no one thought to question. You are living in a world where travel is dangerous, roads are slow, and bandits wait in forests. If you move gold across a kingdom, you do so with fear. A single misstep can leave you robbed or dead. The Templars created a system that removed that fear. Pilgrims could deposit gold at one Templar house and collect it hundreds of miles away, using only a coded document. It was an early form of banking, long before the word existed in its modern sense. What seemed to be simple bookkeeping was, in truth, a network of trust and hidden communication. At the time, rumors began to spread. People whispered that the Templars had secret knowledge, that they possessed coded messages, that they used hidden signs to pass information across continents without anyone noticing. At first, these were dismissed as wild medieval imagination, a classic conspiracy born from fear of what could not be understood. But later generations of historians began to notice something. The Templars used symbols in their ledgers that did not match standard medieval bookkeeping. Strange markings appeared beside names. Numbers were placed in unusual arrangements. Documents traveled between Templar houses faster than seemed possible for the time. The conspiracy began to shift from fantasy toward uncomfortable possibility. You can picture a quiet stone chamber inside a Templar commandery, wooden tables worn smooth by years of use, quills scratching across parchment in slow, careful movements. A hooded clerk pauses, dips his feather into ink, and draws not a letter, but a symbol. To the untrained eye, it means nothing. To those within the order, it may have carried instructions, warnings, or financial truths. Even their buildings hinted at something more. Templar churches were often round, unusual in a world of straight angles. Round architecture made sound behave differently. Whispers carried further along curved walls. Conversations fell into shadows. Sound did not travel where one expected. You can stand in such a room in your mind and feel how secrecy naturally settled there, without effort, without spectacle. The deeper story begins not with battles but with ledgers. The Templars became the guardians of wealth for kings and popes. They stored relics, taxes, and royal fortunes. If you were a powerful ruler, you trusted them because they kept records meticulously. No one else had their reach. No one else had their discipline. But discipline can look like secrecy from the outside. Rumors spread that coded messages were hidden inside prayer texts. That traveling Templars carried silent signals in the way they tied their cloaks or fastened their belts. That certain symbols carved into stone were not decorations but instructions. For centuries these claims were labeled fantasy. Then came discoveries that softened that certainty. Historians examining Templar financial records in later centuries found repeated symbol patterns that did not match known accounting systems of the time. The positions of marks showed consistency across distant Templar houses. Some documents contained hidden layers of writing, visible only when examined under certain angles of light. These were not random. They were deliberate. The Templars had developed a primitive form of secure communication, not magical, not mystical, practical, quiet, necessary. In a world where letters could be intercepted and read by enemies, secrecy was survival. The Templars built a language of symbols that could only be understood by those trained to see it. You can imagine the training itself. A young recruit sitting in a cold stone room, memorizing tiny marks, learning the difference between a curve meant for prayer and one meant for warning, learning how much to reveal and how much to hide. The medieval conspiracy theory said they possessed supernatural secrets. The truth was less dramatic and far more human. They were protecting money, roots, and people in a brutally unstable world. Yet the story did not end quietly. As the Templars grew more powerful, they began to frighten the very rulers who relied upon them. Kings grew uneasy with an organization that could move wealth without armies. Popes grew uncertain of men who answered to no single crown. You can feel the slow tension growing, not through shouting, but through soft suspicion. Conversations held in low voices behind heavy doors. Letters written carefully, then burned. The King of France, Philip the Fair, deeply in debt to the Templars, began to fear that their hidden systems made them too powerful. He could not control what he could not understand. So he chose fear over cooperation. In a move that felt sudden to the world, but had been quietly building for years, he ordered their arrest. Men who had spent their lives in silence were dragged into torchlight. Ledgers were seized. Symbols that once protected secrets were now treated as proof of guilt. They were accused of heresy, blasphemy, and secret rites. Most of these charges were invented, but the real fear lay elsewhere. He feared their knowledge. He feared their codes. Under torture, some confessed to things that were not real, but torture does not reveal truth. It creates stories that stop pain. Many of their true methods died with them, lost in broken memories and scattered pages. This part was once thought to be pure tragedy without substance, but modern scholars examining remaining Templar records have confirmed that their system of coded finance existed. Their symbols were not imaginary. Their structure was real. The medieval world, once again, had created a conspiracy story that sounded wild, but pointed toward a truth hiding in plain stone. As you sit quietly with this part of history, you might imagine holding one of their documents, the parchment dry and cool beneath your fingers. The ink faded just enough to blur meaning. Symbols resting peacefully, silent, waiting. And a question slowly rises, not dramatic, not loud, but steady. If the Templars hid their knowledge so carefully, what parts of it were lost forever when their order fell, and what traces might still remain buried in forgotten stone and dust? As the Templars' power grew quietly across medieval Europe, their influence extended far beyond what the casual observer could notice. You would not have seen armies marching or flags waving. You would have seen courtyards with quiet horses, halls where scribes bent over parchment, and stone staircases echoing only the soft footfalls of disciplined knights. Their strength was invisible, carried in ledgers, in agreements, and in careful, methodical planning. You can imagine one of their regional commanderies, isolated on a hill, stone walls thick enough to withstand siege, but filled with no weapons unless called upon. Inside, men worked from dawn until dusk, their quills scratched in unison. They catalogued grain, silver, land rents, and charitable donations. Every transaction was noted with precision, often encoded in symbols that only trained Templars could interpret. Outside, the village continued its routine as if nothing extraordinary occurred. This is where the true subtlety of the Templars' influence lay. Kings, merchants, and nobles relied on them for safe transport of funds, for reliable collection of taxes, and even for discreet mediation of disputes across borders. A document signed by a Templar clerk could settle arguments without a sword drawn. A ledger could move capital across hundreds of miles without ever leaving a table, a horse, or a wagon. The quiet genius of this network did not escape contemporary eyes entirely. Rumors began to spread that the Templars were more than an order of knights, that they were a hidden power controlling information and wealth behind the surface of daily life. Some whispered about coded instructions and secret messages in architecture. Others suggested that messages traveled faster than the king's envoys, almost as if guided by invisible hands. And yet, for all of this power, the Templars were vulnerable. Their greatest strength, their secrecy, was also their Achilles heel. The very codes and networks that allowed them to operate with near invisibility made them opaque to those in power who were not trained to see their systems. Kings feared what they could not understand. Philip the Fair of France, in particular, became deeply uneasy about a group that could move gold, relay information, and act across borders with autonomy. The tension built slowly, like sediment accumulating beneath a river's surface. From the outside, it may have looked like ordinary politics, treaties, taxes, and debts being disputed, but beneath it was a quiet calculation. The king needed to reassert control over wealth that was not in his hands. Fear began to guide his steps, shaping strategy in subtle ways. Then came the night when fear was acted upon. Across France, in the early hours of October 13th, 1307, Templars were arrested simultaneously. Doors were forced open, men dragged from beds, and chains clinked softly in stone corridors. It was precise, it was planned, and it was extraordinarily quiet, carried out without mobs or chaos. The city itself might have seemed asleep if you had walked its streets. Once imprisoned, the Templars faced relentless interrogation. Some were tortured. Confessions were extracted, often conflicting with reality. Men admitted to heresy, secret oaths, and rituals that never occurred. Chroniclers would later record these confessions as evidence, though historians now know the truth was manipulated. The medieval world had blurred the line between secrecy and crime. The network of knowledge did not vanish entirely, however. Many Templars escaped arrest. Ships sailed from ports with treasure, documents, gold, and valuables moved discreetly. Some fled to Iberia, others to Scotland or the Holy Land. What they carried is partly unknown, but the survival of certain coded manuscripts suggests that fragments of Templar secrets endured. This raises the quiet, unsettling thought that history does not preserve everything. Some knowledge is hidden in plain sight. Some is carried away by a few careful hands, and some disappears entirely into stone, dust, and memory. Even after the order was officially dissolved, the echoes of their influence persisted. Banks and financial networks that emerged in Europe centuries later borrowed, knowingly or unknowingly, from the Templar model. The notion of secure transport of wealth, coded ledgers, and discreet communication had been demonstrated in practice. Ordinary people, relying on systems they could barely comprehend, became part of a network that silently shaped the continent's economy. Yet the most enduring lesson is subtle. Power does not always arrive loudly. It travels in small actions, in careful writing, and in habits repeated day after day. A scribe's quill, a clerk's ledger, a monk's memory, these became instruments of influence as mighty as any sword. And when that power is misunderstood, it can trigger fear that reshapes history, often quietly, without fanfare. You can picture it, centuries later. Someone sifting through stone ruins finds a faint symbol on a wall, a note in a ledger, a cryptic instruction in ink barely visible. These remnants, silent yet persistent, hint at the immense systems built by men who never sought glory, only order, and the human imagination turns those hints into stories of conspiracies, of hidden treasure, of forbidden knowledge. Some are exaggeration, some are curiosity misapplied, but beneath them lies a real, quiet truth. As you reflect on the slow unfolding of these events, you might consider this: if men could build invisible networks so effective that kings feared them, what other systems of quiet influence exist today, shaping lives without recognition or notice? By the time the Templars' order was officially dissolved in the early 14th century, the visible signs of their power had largely vanished. Stone commanderies were seized, lands redistributed, and knights scattered across Europe. Their treasures, both tangible and intangible, seemed to disappear into the quiet of history, and yet, as is often the case, disappearance did not equal disappearance of influence. You can imagine a deserted Templar hall, empty tables, faded frescoes, dust motes dancing in sunlight, streaming through narrow windows. The echo of quills on parchment has vanished, replaced by silence, but the structures remain. The symbols carved into stone remain. The lessons encoded in their meticulous records survive, waiting quietly for someone to notice. Even in the chaos of arrests and trials, some parts of their network endured. Surviving Templars carried knowledge to other regions. They brought lessons about bookkeeping, secured transfer of assets, and risk management to monasteries, noble houses, and emerging banking institutions. Techniques once cloaked in secrecy slowly became absorbed into the growing fabric of European commerce. What is remarkable is that the Templars' story shows the persistence of quiet influence long after apparent defeat. While kings celebrated their victory and chroniclers recorded dramatic tales of heresy and punishment, the ordinary, methodical work of the Templars shaped the course of economic and organizational history. It moved like a shadow behind the visible world, unseen by those who thought they had won. The conspiracy theories that grew up around them, hidden treasure, secret codes, mysterious rituals, served a purpose beyond intrigue. They disguised a truth too subtle to recognize at the time, that structured, disciplined knowledge can be as powerful as armies. Fear amplified the story, but it was the systems, not the drama, that endured. You might picture a scholar centuries later, flipping through surviving Templar manuscripts, noting the patterns in symbols, the careful cataloguing of property, the coded instructions. What was once dismissed as cryptic nonsense now reveals insight into how an organization could operate effectively across continents in an age of slow travel and limited communication. The quiet genius is in the habit, repetition, and meticulous attention to detail. It is a lesson about history itself. Not all power announces itself loudly. Often, it works invisibly, carried through routine, precision, and the patient accumulation of knowledge. Fear can distort perception, creating myths, while the real lessons are hidden in plain sight, waiting for those willing to observe patiently. The Knights Templar vanished as an organization, but their ideas lingered. Modern banking, insurance, and organized financial networks owe a subtle debt to the systems they developed. Architecture that conveyed secret meaning and symbol-rich documents foreshadowed centuries of coded communication. Their story reminds you that influence does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it resides in quiet discipline and deliberate thought. As you imagine the empty halls, the faded symbols, and the meticulous ledgers, consider this: power can disappear from view, and yet continue to shape the world in small, almost imperceptible ways. The conspiracies that filled medieval minds may have been exaggerated, but the truth they concealed was quietly enduring and far more remarkable than any myth. And so, the Silent Order teaches a gentle lesson. Even in a world that appears chaotic, systems of knowledge, discipline, and careful planning leave an imprint far longer than the loud proclamations of kings and the dramatic gestures of war. What is hidden today may become the foundation of tomorrow, quietly shaping history in ways that the world does not immediately see. In the streets of medieval Bologna, the air was a mixture of smoke from hearths, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the faint tang of animals in pens along narrow lanes. Life moved slowly, shaped by routines. Merchants opened shops at first light, monks chanted in nearby convents, and students from the universities roamed the cobbled streets, books tucked under their arms. You could walk these streets and see nothing extraordinary. Yet, beneath this ordinary rhythm, a quiet tension was building, one that would later feed centuries of speculation about plots, poison, and conspiracies. The University of Bologna was already renowned by the early 14th century. It drew scholars from across Europe who studied law, philosophy, and medicine. Its halls echoed with the scratch of quills, the rustle of parchment, and soft, serious discussions about logic, ethics, and justice. Here, in classrooms and libraries, the foundations of modern European thought were taking shape, but so too were rivalries that simmered beneath the surface. You can imagine a young student arriving in Bologna, eager for knowledge. He notices the patterns, the professors' schedules, the timing of lectures, the intricate arrangements of academic debates. He may not see the quiet rivalries forming, the grudges that fester, or the whispers exchanged in shadowed corners of the library. And yet, these small interactions carried consequences that could stretch far beyond the university walls. At the heart of one famous controversy was the use of a poisoned chalice, a metaphor and a literal suspicion, depending on whom you ask. In the early 14th century, accusations arose that one faction of students or faculty might be attempting to eliminate rivals by contaminating food or drink. The fear of poisoning was not a sudden leap. It grew from ordinary observation. Cups were shared in halls, wine was poured from common casks, and meals were communal. One mistake, one deliberate act, could end a life quietly and suddenly. Rumors moved faster than the truth. People whispered that certain professors had secret enemies, that students were plotting revenge, that allies within the city were ready to strike. Yet when authorities investigated, they rarely found evidence. Confessions were coerced, often extracted under duress. Many believed the accusations stemmed from paranoia rather than reality. But a quieter, more credible story persisted. Food and drink in medieval cities were often contaminated, not by human conspiracy, but by accident. Wine was stored in reused barrels, water was drawn from open sources, and spices were scarce and expensive. A mismanaged cask could easily produce illness. What seemed like a malicious act was often the slow, invisible work of bacteria, fungi, or poor sanitation. Imagine a scholar raising a goblet to his lips. The liquid looks pure, the aroma faint but pleasant. He drinks and feels unwell within hours. He tells a friend, who then tells another. By the next day, the story has changed. Poison, one says. An enemy, another insists. What began as a quiet misfortune has transformed into a conspiracy, even if no human intention existed. What makes Bologna particularly interesting is how these rumors intersected with academic hierarchy. Professors and students alike were deeply concerned with reputation and influence. Being accused, even falsely, could ruin a career, a family's social standing, or a city's political balance. And in a world without modern science, where the causes of illness were mysterious, fear filled the gaps in understanding. You can picture city officials walking through cobbled streets, whispering behind closed doors. They question tavern keepers, scholars, and students. Some are cooperative, others evasive. The city's governance itself becomes a player in the story, trying to maintain order while deciphering fact from rumor. By studying surviving records, historians have discovered patterns that are fascinating in their quiet detail. Several illnesses that were attributed to poisoning coincided with seasonal outbreaks of foodborne disease. What was interpreted as malicious intent was, in many cases, a slow process of spoilage, fermentation gone wrong, contaminated grain, or tainted water. And yet, the stories of poisoned chalices did not vanish. They became entwined with the identity of the university and the city. For centuries afterward, Bologna would be remembered in part for the whispers of secret plots, of academic rivalries carried to the edge of fatality, even if the real culprit was far more mundane. You can feel the tension quietly building in your mind. A scholar reaches for a cup, a rumor spreads across a lecture hall, and a city holds its breath. Knowledge, fear, and human fallibility intertwine, creating a story that is both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. The open question lingers, soft and unresolved, in a world where accidents can be interpreted as conspiracies. How many events in history were shaped not by intent, but by misunderstanding, perception, and the slow spread of fear? The story of Bologna's poisoned chalice did not unfold in dramatic sweeps, nor did it rely on swords or armies. It moved in whispers, in ledger notes, in conversations held quietly in shadowed corners of lecture halls. Life continued in its measured rhythms. Students attended classes, merchants traded wares, and townsfolk drew water from the same wells that had sustained generations. Yet beneath this ordinary surface, suspicion spread like a slow fog, settling into every corner of city life. You can picture a professor preparing his lecture, quill in hand, parchment spread neatly before him. Outside the window, the city hums with the steady cadence of daily activity. A student enters, bows politely, and takes a seat. But even in these quiet moments, awareness lingers. Did someone deliberately spoil the bread last night? Did the wine come from a barrel touched by a rival? Fear, subtle and pervasive, colors every gesture and glance. In the absence of modern science, people interpreted illness through observation, tradition, and anecdote. The timing of sickness, the sudden collapse of a student, or the mild discomfort of a scholar could all be construed as evidence of foul play. Authorities, seeking to maintain order, investigated reports with a combination of ritualized procedure and careful caution. City magistrates summoned witnesses, collected testimony, and sometimes issued warnings, but definitive proof was rarely attainable. What emerges from historical records is a fascinating interplay of human perception and environmental reality. Many illnesses, attributed to intentional poisoning, were almost certainly accidental. Food storage practices were rudimentary. Grain and bread could ferment, wine could sour, and water could harbor invisible contaminants. Yet, in a society accustomed to attributing misfortune to human agency or divine will, these mundane causes often became entwined with stories of intrigue and conspiracy. At the University of Bologna, the hierarchical structure of academia amplified these tensions. Professors wielded authority over students, and students wielded influence over their peers. Competition for recognition, positions, and patronage was fierce. A rumor, true or false, could spread rapidly through the corridors and libraries, altering social dynamics in subtle but lasting ways. You can imagine a young student whispering to a friend in the library, "Did you hear about the chalice? They say it was poisoned." The friend hesitates, looks around nervously, then repeats the story with slight embellishment. By the next day, the rumor has shifted shape. Now it is a deliberate plot by a rival faction, carried out under cover of night. Each retelling strengthens the narrative, regardless of factual basis. Even civic authorities found themselves ensnared in this web of uncertainty. When reports of poisoning surfaced, they were obliged to act, if only to maintain public confidence. Investigations were conducted, testimonies recorded, and sometimes arrests were made. The focus was less on uncovering truth than on preventing panic and preserving the city's reputation. Small, cautious interventions were preferred to dramatic public trials. Yet the consequences of these suspicions extended beyond immediate fear. The culture of vigilance affected daily life, subtly shaping habits and behaviors. Students became careful about sharing cups, professors scrutinized the sources of their food and wine, and townsfolk remained alert to the potential for unseen danger. Over time, these practices fostered a slow awareness of hygiene, cleanliness, and communal responsibility, even if the scientific understanding remained centuries away. What makes this chapter of history quietly compelling is the interplay between perception and reality. The idea of the poisoned chalice, part rumor, part fear, reveals how human societies interpret risk and navigate uncertainty. People acted not only on fact, but on the plausible, on the patterns they observed, and on the narratives that seemed to explain a confusing and sometimes threatening world. In this slow unfolding, you can sense the resilience of ordinary life. Scholars continued to study, merchants continued to trade, and families continued to eat and drink. Yet beneath these routines, human perception, rumor, and fear created invisible structures of influence, quietly guiding decisions and shaping behaviors for years to come. And so, the story of Bologna leaves a subtle but persistent question. In a world where ordinary accidents can become legendary conspiracies, how much of history reflects intention, and how much reflects the human tendency to find patterns, even where none exist? As time passed, the immediate fears of poisoned cups in Bologna faded, but their effects lingered quietly, woven into the fabric of daily life. Students continued to sip from their personal flasks, professors scrutinized the sources of food and drink, and city authorities remained watchful of both rumor and reality. Life had adapted, subtly and almost imperceptibly, to the lessons of suspicion and caution. Imagine walking through the city's narrow streets years later. The marketplace is bustling, bread and wine displayed for sale, children chase each other along cobblestones, and the distant hum of scholarly discussion drifts from lecture halls. To an outsider, it seems normal. Yet beneath this ordinary scene, the city has been reshaped by centuries of learned vigilance, habits, precautions, and quiet attentions to safety, born from fear of conspiracies that may never have existed, have become part of everyday life. The poisoned chalice story illustrates a broader truth about human societies. Perception often drives action as much as reality. While modern historians have determined that most of the alleged poisonings were accidental, spoiled wine, contaminated food, or bacterial illness, the narrative of intent shaped behavior for generations. People developed early forms of public health awareness long before the concept existed formally. Wells were protected, wine was stored more carefully, and communal meals were approached with caution. Fear, though exaggerated, prompted adaptations that improved safety in subtle, practical ways. What is remarkable is how ordinary people became participants in a quiet process of learning and adaptation. They did not have laboratories, microscopes, or scientific journals. Instead, they relied on observation, rumor, trial and error, and communal memory. A student noting that a fellow scholar fell ill after a shared cup contributed to a chain of awareness that influenced behaviors far beyond the university walls. A professor choosing to examine food more carefully passed on lessons to apprentices who would carry the practice into their own homes. Even civic authorities contributed to this invisible legacy. Magistrates, unable to discern truth from rumor fully, still implemented measures that minimized risk. Drinking water was monitored more closely. Food vendors were held accountable for basic hygiene. Rules and practices that once seemed minor became building blocks for communal resilience. In this sense, the conspiracy, though imagined, produced a form of unintended wisdom. Yet the story is also a reminder of how easily fear can distort understanding. Accusations were made, reputations were damaged, and lives were disrupted, all because humans naturally seek patterns, causes, and culprits when faced with uncertainty. The poisoned chalice was less a plot than a mirror of the anxieties and assumptions of medieval life, reflecting the limits of knowledge at the time. As centuries passed, historians pieced together fragments of this narrative from manuscripts, city records, and scholarly notes. The narrative of intrigue often overshadowed the quieter truths of precaution, observation, and adaptation. But the evidence shows that the behaviors developed during this period laid the groundwork for improved hygiene, careful food handling, and early forms of public health consciousness. Standing quietly with this story, you can feel both the fragility and resilience of human life in medieval Bologna. Ordinary people faced invisible threats, often misinterpreted, yet found ways to adapt. Rumor, fear, and perception guided action. sometimes more effectively than knowledge alone. And in these small, measured adjustments, communities survived, learned, and slowly improved their circumstances. The final reflection of this story lingers like a quiet echo. History is shaped not only by grand events and dramatic conspiracies, but also by the subtle interactions of ordinary people with uncertainty, danger, and one another. Fear may mislead, but it also teaches. Observation, even in the absence of understanding, becomes wisdom, and small, cautious actions taken quietly in the shadows of routine life can leave a lasting imprint on the world. On the windswept coast of medieval England, there once stood a town known as Dunwich. You might imagine narrow streets lined with timber-framed houses, the salty smell of the sea mingling with smoke from hearths, and fishermen hauling nets heavy with herring and cod. The town thrived quietly for centuries, its church towers visible from miles out at sea, its markets filled with the steady rhythm of daily commerce. Yet beneath this seemingly ordinary life lay a slow, almost imperceptible danger that would transform the town's future in ways both literal and terrifying. Dunwich was not remarkable for battles or dynastic intrigue. It was remarkable for its size, prosperity, and location. At its height in the 12th and 13th centuries, it was one of the largest ports in England, second only to London in trade volume. Ships came from Flanders, the Low Countries, and across the North Sea, bringing goods, grain, wine, and textiles. Merchants, sailors, and townspeople conducted their lives in a steady rhythm, loading cargo, trading goods, repairing nets, and maintaining homes that had stood for generations. Yet this bustling town had a vulnerability few noticed. It was perched on a low-lying coastline, on land composed of soft clays and sands, constantly shaped by tides, storms, and erosion. While everyday life seemed stable, the sea and soil were slowly undermining the very foundations of the town. Houses leaned slightly, church walls cracked, and streets occasionally flooded after heavy rains. At first, these were minor inconveniences, easy to repair, easy to ignore, but over decades, these small changes compounded. Imagine walking along Dunwich's main street. The cobblestones are uneven beneath your feet. A bell tower tilts slightly, casting a distorted shadow across the market. The wind whips sea spray through narrow alleys, carrying the scent of salt and fish. And underfoot, the ground shifts imperceptibly, a quiet reminder that the earth itself is not always stable. Medieval townspeople did not understand erosion scientifically. They attributed flooding to divine displeasure, or the wrath of saints. Some whispered that curses or witches were at work. Others believed the town might be protected by holy relics, prayers, or offerings. Yet none could fully explain why their streets, houses, and walls slowly crumbled into the sea. By the mid-14th century, these small erosions began to escalate. Winter storms battered the coastline, removing large portions of sandy cliff and undermining structures that had stood for generations. The great church of St. James, once the town's proud centerpiece, began to collapse slowly, stone by stone, as the cliff beneath it eroded into the North Sea. Homes closest to the shore disappeared overnight in violent storms, leaving families homeless and terrified. You can imagine the quiet panic. Children carried belongings from collapsing houses. Fishermen watched the docks crumble as ships tilted awkwardly in the shifting sands. Townspeople whispered of conspiracies. Some blamed the king's officials for neglecting sea defences. Others accused neighbouring ports of foul magic to weaken Dunwich's prosperity. In truth, the culprit was far simpler. The unrelenting work of natural forces, slow and steady, invisible to the casual observer, but powerful enough to change lives. What makes Dunwich's story quietly extraordinary is how human perception transformed natural disaster into narrative. People feared deliberate plots, but the truth was far less sensational, and yet more enduring. Erosion, storm surges, and coastal instability were slowly reclaiming the town. Its decline did not happen overnight. It happened incrementally, unnoticed, until the cumulative effect became undeniable. By the time the 16th century arrived, much of Dunwich had disappeared into the North Sea. Streets once filled with merchants lay underwater, church towers collapsed or tilted into the waves. Only small fragments of the town remained, silently reminding future generations of the impermanence of even prosperous settlements. This story is not merely about natural forces, but about human experience. How communities interpret danger, how rumors and conspiracies arise from uncertainty, and how ordinary life can be quietly reshaped by invisible processes. The people of Dunwich adapted for decades, tried to rebuild, and speculated about causes, yet ultimately, nature wrote its own story, indifferent to rumour, legend, or fear. And so, as you consider Dunwich, you might quietly ask yourself, in a world where danger creeps slowly and invisibly, how often do we misinterpret the causes of decline, attributing events to human malice, when the real forces are silent, patient, and unobserved? The decline of Dunwich was not marked by sudden catastrophe alone. It was a slow, relentless process, unfolding over decades, sometimes unnoticed by those living through it. Houses that once seemed stable began to lean at unsettling angles. Streets, once paved and orderly, developed cracks and depressions. The sand and clay upon which the town was built gradually gave way to the encroaching sea. What seems like a minor inconvenience at first, flooded basements, leaning walls, occasional collapse, became a persistent, almost invisible erosion that quietly shaped daily life. You can imagine a family living near the harbour. The father checks the tide each morning before setting out to fish, noting subtle shifts in water levels. The mother rebuilds sections of a wall that have crumbled overnight, using sand and timber, hoping that the repairs will hold until the next storm passes. Children walk carefully along uneven cobbles, carrying buckets for water, avoiding puddles that have slowly accumulated from small breaches in the town's drainage. Each act of adaptation is modest, but together they form a pattern of resilience. Medieval townspeople had little understanding of coastal geology. They attributed misfortune to divine will, bad luck, or occasionally malicious human intent. Some whispered that rival towns or officials were secretly undermining Dunwich to redirect trade elsewhere. Others imagined curses or witches were at work. Yet the truth was simpler. The combined force of wind, tide, and soft soil was gradually dismantling the town, one house and one street at a time. Churches, as the tallest and most prominent structures, were particularly vulnerable. St. James Church, perched precariously on the cliff, began to show the first signs of serious damage. Stone walls cracked, buttresses leaned, and towers tilted toward the sea. Parishioners feared the collapse not just because of structural danger, but because of symbolic meaning. The church had always represented stability, community, and divine protection. Its slow destruction became a tangible reminder of impermanence and uncertainty. The local economy also suffered quietly, but steadily. Merchants relied on stable wharves and docks to unload goods. As the coastline eroded, piers became unsafe, and ships had difficulty docking. Fishermen had to venture further into unpredictable waters, risking storms and shipwrecks. Grain and wine, vital for trade and sustenance, were lost in minor floods or damaged by encroaching salt water. Over time, these small disruptions accumulated, making commerce more difficult and life more precarious. Amid this slow crisis, people developed adaptive behaviors that were practical, yet often subtle. Temporary structures were built further inland. Houses were reinforced with sandbags or timber, often at the expense of aesthetic or architectural considerations. Roads were rerouted to avoid unstable ground. Communities maintained a quiet vigilance, scanning cliffs and shores for early signs of collapse. These were not heroic or dramatic acts. They were ordinary, patient, and necessary adaptations to an environment that had shifted imperceptibly. Yet the human tendency to explain misfortune through narrative remained. Rumors about sabotage, magic, or divine punishment circulated alongside practical knowledge. Some townsfolk insisted that neighboring ports had somehow conspired to steal Dunwich's prosperity. Others whispered that certain families had angered the saints. These stories provided emotional frameworks for understanding events that in reality had no conscious human cause. Historians studying the remnants of Dunwich centuries later have been struck by the interplay of natural forces and human perception. Archaeological evidence shows streets gradually collapsing into the sea, house foundations undermined by shifting sand, and docks partially submerged by rising tides. Yet alongside this evidence are signs of human adaptation, reinforced structures, relocated buildings, and communal measures to mitigate loss. The story of Dunwich is thus one of both vulnerability and resilience, illustrating how ordinary people respond to slow, invisible threats. By considering these quiet adjustments and adaptations, a pattern emerges. Communities do not simply vanish in the face of environmental pressure. They respond incrementally, negotiating survival with the tools and knowledge available to them. Even when the ultimate outcome is unavoidable, the record of these adaptations offers insight into medieval life, priorities, and ingenuity. And so, as you reflect on Dunwich, the question quietly emerges: if a thriving town could be undone not by sudden violence, but by imperceptible natural forces, How many other communities throughout history were shaped, diminished, or destroyed in ways that left only faint traces, misinterpreted by those who came later? By the late 15th century, Dunwich had ceased to be the thriving port it once was. Houses, churches, and streets had collapsed into the North Sea, leaving behind only fragments of foundations and gravestones, some partially submerged and others scattered by storms. What remained of the town existed mostly in memory, in the records of chroniclers, and in the quiet erosion of the coastline itself. You can imagine standing on the cliffs where Dunwich once flourished, listening to the wind whipping across the sand and hearing the soft crash of waves against eroded cliffs. There are no merchants calling from market stalls, no students rushing to lectures, no fishermen hauling nets, only the patient rhythm of the sea, slowly reclaiming what was once land. Yet, beneath this apparent emptiness, the story of human adaptation and resilience remains palpable. The decline of Dunwich teaches a subtle but enduring lesson. Environmental forces can reshape human life gradually and inexorably, even without dramatic catastrophes or wars. Unlike the sudden destruction of cities by fire or siege, Dunwich vanished slowly, almost imperceptibly, leaving generations of inhabitants to adapt, rebuild, and cope with uncertainty. Their efforts relocating homes, reinforcing structures, altering trade routes, illustrate a kind of resilience that is often overlooked in traditional histories focused on grand events and conspicuous heroism. The people of Dunwich, while ultimately unable to stop the sea, demonstrated a quiet pragmatism. Families adjusted to rising waters, merchants sought safer harbours, and the community developed strategies to preserve livelihoods amid uncertainty. In a world without modern engineering or scientific understanding of coastal erosion, these incremental adaptations reveal an impressive understanding of observation, risk, and precaution. Yet the human tendency to explain misfortune through narrative persisted. Chroniclers recorded stories of curses, divine displeasure, and even human treachery, overlaying the mundane reality of natural erosion with dramatic interpretations. Over time, these stories became part of the town's legend, ensuring that Dunwich would be remembered not only as a vanished port but as a place of mystery and conspiracy. This is one of the enduring threads in medieval history. Perception and interpretation often carry as much weight as actual events. Modern archaeology and historical research have reconstructed much of Dunwich's story. Submerged foundations, remnants of streets, and decayed church structures provide evidence of a once thriving community undone by environmental forces. Maps and documents illustrate how buildings were relocated, trade patterns shifted, and social networks adapted to slow but relentless change. What emerges is a portrait of ordinary people, navigating extraordinary circumstances with diligence, patience, and creativity. The story of Dunwich resonates beyond its medieval context. It reminds us that human societies are deeply vulnerable to gradual, invisible threats. It also shows that adaptation and resilience do not always produce dramatic victories. They can exist quietly, in small choices and persistent efforts that leave traces for those who know where to look. The town's disappearance into the sea is tragic, yet its lessons endure. Careful observation, communal planning, and incremental action are powerful tools in the face of uncertainty. Finally, the quiet reflection remains. How many other towns, communities, or even civilizations have been shaped, diminished, or erased by forces so gradual that they were mistaken for misfortune, divine judgment, or human error? How much of history is written, not by dramatic events, but by the slow, almost imperceptible shaping of ordinary life, by unseen and inexorable forces? Dunwich teaches that while human perception may misinterpret causes, the responses it inspires, adaptation, caution, and resilience, can carry profound lessons forward, far beyond the physical survival of the town itself.